One small choice can act as a catalyst, starting a chain reaction that changes the course of a lifetime forever. Witness the explosive power of a single moment in our newest collection of intense, high-stakes cinematic narratives. Hit subscribe now and be there for the moment everything changes. On the night of my son's engagement party, he stood up in front of 60 people, raised his glass, and said the man sitting beside him had taught him everything he knew about being a real man. Then he looked straight at me and added that he finally had the father figure he always deserved. He put his arm around Richard, his future father-in-law, and everyone applauded. I sat at my table, untouched champagne in front of me, and I smiled. Because in my jacket pocket was an envelope, and my son had no idea what was inside it. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old, retired from 31 years on the floor at the General Motors assembly plant in Oshawa, Ontario. I have a pension that covers my mortgage and groceries if I'm careful, a 2009 Silverado that runs well enough, and a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood in Whitby that I've been slowly fixing up since my wife Margaret passed 4 years ago. I am not a wealthy man. I have never pretended to be. I worked hard. I raised my son. I paid my taxes. And I went home. That was my life. That was enough. My son's name is Patrick. He's 32 now, works in commercial real estate in Toronto, drives a car that costs more than I made in 3 years at the plant, and lives in a condo downtown that he chose specifically because it was in the right postal code. He married into a family that runs 3 medical clinics in the Greater Toronto area, and from the moment he started dating Claire, something in him shifted, like a dial being slowly turned until the frequency changed entirely, and he couldn't hear me anymore. Claire is not a bad person. I want to be clear about that. She was always polite to me, always pleasant at family dinners when they still happened, always careful with her words in a way that felt practiced rather than warm. Her father, Richard Calloway, is the kind of man who fills every room he walks into, not with noise, but with the quiet certainty that he is the most important person present. He owns things. He funds things. He has a name that appears on plaques in hospital lobbies. He looked at me exactly once at the first family dinner, the kind of once-over that takes 1/10 of a second, but says everything. And after that, he looked through me the way you look through a window when you're interested in what's outside. Patrick started noticing things around the time of the engagement. Little things first. He called me in February to mention, almost casually, that the engagement party was going to be held at the Calloway family's property in Oakville, a Victorian house on 2 acres that Richard had restored. He said it as though he was sharing exciting news. Then he paused and said, "It'll be a nice crowd, Dad. Professionals, a lot of Claire's family's colleagues, just, keep it easy." I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "Just be yourself, but maybe don't go on too long about the plant mill that." These people are used to a certain kind of conversation. I told him I understood. I did understand. I just hadn't realized yet how much he meant it. The engagement party invitation arrived in a cream envelope with gold script. It listed a 7 o'clock start time on the last Saturday of March. I pressed my good gray blazer, shined my shoes, bought a bottle of Niagara Peninsula Riesling that the woman at the LCBO said was excellent, and drove out to Oakville. The Calloway property was everything you'd expect. Circular driveway, landscape lighting, a house that looked like it belonged on a heritage calendar. I arrived at 7:05 and rang the bell with my wine in hand, feeling the particular self-consciousness of a man who knows he is out of place, but has decided not to show it. A woman in catering black took my coat and my bottle without a word, and directed me toward the back garden, where heat lamps glowed over white-clothed tables, and servers moved through clusters of well-dressed guests with trays of food I couldn't name. I looked for Patrick and found him near the bar, laughing with a group of men in expensive jackets. He saw me, gave a short wave, and held up a finger. 1 minute. That 1 minute turned into 25. I found a spot at the edge of the gathering, accepted a glass of wine from a passing server, and stood watching. Richard Calloway worked the crowd with the ease of a man born to it. He remembered names. He touched arms. He laughed in a way that made everyone around him feel included. Patrick followed him like a shadow and I noticed, maybe for the first time in an undeniable way, that my son moved differently in that world. Looser, more confident, like he'd found a version of himself that fit better than the one I'd raised. He came to me eventually, brought me over to meet a few people, introduced me quickly as my dad, he's from Whitby, and then guided the conversation so smoothly away from anything I might add that I understood my role for the evening. I was there to be counted, not to speak. I found the seat at one of the round tables near the heat lamps and ate my food and listened to conversations around me about investment properties and private school applications and a new restaurant in Yorkville that everyone apparently agreed was extraordinary. A man beside me asked what I did, and when I told him I was retired from GM in Oshawa, he nodded with the specific kind of smile that means nothing and turned to the person on his other side. Then came the toasts. Richard went first. He spoke about Claire with genuine warmth, about watching her grow into a woman who knew her worth and chose accordingly. He said Patrick was exactly the man he'd hoped his daughter would find, driven, ambitious, someone who understood what really mattered. He said he looked forward to welcoming Patrick fully into their family. Everyone raised their glasses. Then Patrick stood up. He spoke beautifully. He always could. He talked about meeting Claire, about the moment he realized she was the person he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. He talked about the values he'd learned, about excellence, about striving, about never settling for less than the best version of yourself. Then he looked at Richard. He said Richard had shown him more about being a man in the past 2 years than he'd learned in the 30 before. He said Richard had taught him how to carry himself, how to think about his future, how to build something that mattered. He said that for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to have a father figure he could truly look up to. He put his hand on Richard's shoulder. Richard gripped his arm. Everyone applauded. Patrick never looked at me during any of it. I did not flinch. I raised my glass with everyone else. I smiled the way you smile when you've just been told something that cannot be untaken, when you understand that the ground beneath the relationship has been shifting for years, and you've only just now felt the final collapse. Beside me, a woman I didn't know leaned over and whispered, "Is that your son?" And when I said yes, she said, "Oh, just that, just oh," and looked back toward the front of the room. I drove home on the QEW with the windows down despite the cold, needing the air, 31 years of overtime and double shifts. Every school trip paid for, every hockey registration, every university application fee and residence deposit and textbook list. Margaret's voice on our last anniversary, 3 weeks before the diagnosis. Patrick is going to be something else, Jerry. We did that. We did that together. I talk to her out loud sometimes still. In the truck, mostly. I don't know what we did wrong, I said to the highway. But I knew. We hadn't done anything wrong. We just run out of usefulness. I got home at 11:30 and sat in Margaret's chair by the living room window, the green wingback she'd had since before we were married, and I thought for a long time. On the side table was a folder I'd been holding onto for 6 months. I'd almost shown it to Patrick twice. Both times, something had stopped me. A reluctance to change things that couldn't be changed back. But sitting there in the quiet house, I understood that the reluctance was no longer mine to honor. I opened the folder and looked at the papers inside. Then I made myself a cup of tea and went to bed. The weeks after the party settled into a new pattern. Patrick called on Sundays. Perfunctory calls that lasted 8 minutes on average. He asked about my health. I asked about the wedding planning. He said things were progressing. I said that sounded good. The calls felt like an obligation being managed on both ends, except I actually wanted to talk to him, which made it lonelier. In April, he called to tell me the wedding date, a Saturday in late June at a venue in Niagara-on-the-Lake. He mentioned it was a vineyard property. He mentioned the reception would be for 200 guests. He mentioned a rehearsal dinner the night before. He did not mention my role in any of it. I asked carefully whether I'd be walking him to the ceremony, doing any kind of reading. Anything. There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. He said they were keeping the ceremony structure pretty simple, mostly immediate family on Claire's side since Richard was helping with most of the arrangements, and that I should just come and enjoy the day. He'd make sure I had a great seat. A great seat. I said that sounded fine. I asked what time everything started. He said 2 o'clock. I thanked him, and we said goodbye, and I went and stood in the backyard for 20 minutes watching the neighbor's dog move along the fence line. 2 weeks before the wedding, the formal invitation arrived. Cream cardstock, gold lettering, the vineyard's crest embossed in the corner. I read it carefully. The ceremony was listed at 2 o'clock. I set it on the kitchen table and went to finish painting the back porch. 3 days before the wedding, I drove up to Oshawa to visit my old friend Dennis Kowalski, who I'd worked beside on the line for 22 years. We sat in his kitchen and drank coffee, and he listened to everything I told him. He didn't say much until I finished. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" I told him I was going to go to the wedding. I was going to be present, and I was going to give my son his gift. Dennis asked what the gift was. I told him he'd find out afterward. On the Friday before the wedding, I drove to Niagara-on-the-Lake and checked into a motel on the edge of town. I pressed my suit, the dark charcoal one I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, to Patrick's convocation, to every moment that had asked something serious of me, and I hung it carefully on the back of the door. The rehearsal dinner was at the vineyard. Patrick had texted to say I was welcome to come. 7:30, though it'll mostly be Claire's extended family, fair warning. I went. I sat at a table near the back with two of Claire's cousins from Halifax, who were friendly enough and asked good questions and seemed genuinely interested when I talked about the plant and about Whitby and about Margaret's garden, which I was still trying to maintain. I felt something close to normal for the first time in months. Patrick came to my table once, briefly, to check that I had enough to eat. He called me Dad in a tone that meant he was being observed. I told him the food was excellent. I told him I was proud of him. I meant both things. He nodded, squeezed my shoulder once, and went back to Richard's table. On Saturday morning, I woke at 6 and took a slow walk along the lake shore in the early light. The water was flat and gray-green, the kind of calm that holds before weather changes. I thought about Margaret, about the trip we'd taken to Niagara-on-the-Lake on her 20th anniversary, about the way she'd laughed at something I said over dinner, and then looked at me with that particular look, the one that meant she was glad she'd chosen me. I thought about Patrick at 4 years old with his face pressed to the car window, watching the same lake and saying, "Dad, it goes forever." "It does," I told him. "It almost does." I went back to the motel. I showered and dressed and tucked my envelope carefully into the inside pocket of my jacket. I checked the clock. I had 3 hours. I arrived at the vineyard property at 1:30, 30 minutes before ceremony time. The grounds were beautiful. Late June sun on old stone buildings, rows of vines in the distance, white chairs arranged on a terrace overlooking the escarpment. Guests were still arriving in clusters, well-dressed and cheerful, the particular relaxed energy of a summer wedding. I found a seat on the groom's side, 3 rows back. A woman with a clipboard came and asked if I was immediate family, and I told her I was the father of the groom. Her expression shifted in a way that made me look at her more carefully. She said, "Oh, we actually have a reserved section up front for you. Sorry, let me show you." She walked me to the front row, where 2 seats were marked with small ivory ribbons. One of them already held a jacket. Richard's, I recognized it. The woman with the clipboard gestured to the other seat and said, "There we go," and moved away. I sat down. At 1:45, a man I didn't recognize came and collected Richard from the seat beside me. He leaned down and said something about photographs, and Richard stood, straight in his jacket, and followed him without acknowledging me. At 2 o'clock, the music began. The ceremony was conducted on the stone terrace, officiated by someone who clearly knew Claire's family well, and made the kind of personal references that require real history. Patrick came down the aisle looking like a man who had fully arrived in the life he'd chosen, tall and calm and happy, flanked by his 2 groomsmen, and I felt something uncomplicated watching him. He was beautiful. He was my son. Whatever else had broken down between us, he was still the boy who had pressed his face to the car window at the lake and thought it went forever. Then the music changed, and Claire appeared, and beside her, offering her his arm and guiding her down the white ribboned aisle with the confident solemnity of a man who owned the moment, was Richard. I turned forward and watched the ceremony. The officiant spoke about love as a deliberate practice, about the choice to show up daily for another person. He asked Patrick and Claire to face each other. They exchanged vows they had clearly written themselves, careful and specific and true to them. And I thought that whatever my feelings about everything else, this part, this moment between the two of them, was real. And it was good. And I was grateful to witness it. When they kissed, the guests applauded, and I applauded with them. Then the receiving line formed, and I stood in it. And when Patrick reached me, he took my hand and then pulled me into a hug. And for a second, just a second, I felt the weight of him the way I used to when he was small, and I held it. "Proud of you," I said. "Thanks, Dad," he said, and moved on. The reception was held in the Vineyards event hall. Long tables and candlelight, and the smell of good food and summer heat. I was seated at a table with some of Patrick's friends from his university days. Good young men who asked about Whitby and about retirement and shook my hand warmly. I felt like myself. I ate and I talked, and I accepted a glass of Niagara Chardonnay and watched my son across the room, happy in his element, at the center of the world he had built for himself. The speeches came after dinner. Claire's sister went first and made everyone laugh and cry in the right places. Then the best man, Patrick's friend from university, spoke with the ease of someone who had known him long enough to be honest, and he was both funny and kind. And when he said, "Patrick is the most loyal person I know," I felt the words land somewhere complicated. Then Richard stood. He spoke about Claire first, warmly and without the practiced ease of the engagement party. This was more personal, and I could see it cost him something, and I respected him for it. Then he turned to Patrick and said he had watched him over 2 years and found him to be a man of real quality. A man who understood what family meant. A man worth calling a son. He said he was honored to be gaining him. He did not mention me. Then Patrick stood. He spoke gracefully, as he always did. He thanked Claire's parents. He thanked the venue, his groomsmen, his friends. He looked around the room with the ease of a man comfortable in his own story. He said he'd spent a long time looking for the right model of what a man should be. He said he'd been lucky to find it in Richard, who had shown him that real strength meant building something, investing in people, knowing your own worth, and making sure others knew theirs. He said having Richard in his life had been one of the great gifts of adulthood. Then he looked at Richard and said, "I didn't always have the example I needed growing up, but I have it now." Then he sat down. Around the room, glasses were raised, music cued, conversation resumed. The evening pressed forward. I sat still for a moment. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and touched the envelope. I had not moved it in 3 days. I had taken it out twice to look at the papers inside, and both times I had thought, not yet, not yet, not yet. Now I thought, now. I found Patrick during the brief gap between the first dances, when he and Claire were making their way between tables accepting congratulations. I stepped into their path, and he looked surprised to see me standing there with intention. "Dad," he said, "you okay?" "I'm well," I said. "I just wanted to give you a gift." I held out the envelope with both hands. He took it with one, glanced at it, smiled the way you smile at something that requires acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said. "We'll open everything later." "I'd prefer you open this one now," I said. Quietly, evenly, no edge in my voice. Something in my tone made him look at me properly. The same way he'd looked at me at the engagement party for exactly 1 moment before looking away, except this time he didn't look away. Claire said, "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I said. "This one just has a time limit." Patrick passed his champagne to Claire and opened the envelope. Inside were 2 documents held together with a paperclip. The first was a 1-page letter I had written in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, 6 weeks ago, after sitting in Margaret's chair for 3 hours. I had written 8 drafts. The final one was the shortest. "Patrick," it said, "there are things you should have been told years ago, and that's my failure as much as anyone's. But there are also things I want you to understand about what's in this envelope, and about what I've given you over the past 32 years. Not the money, not the registrations and the deposits and the overtime, but the presence. The choice to be there, every time, without being asked. I'm telling you this not so you'll feel guilty, but so you'll understand What you're holding. What you're holding is the deed to the house in Whitby, transferred to your name effective July 1st. Margaret wanted you to have it. I promised her you would, under one condition, which I've noted in the transfer documents. The property cannot be sold for 10 years from the date of transfer. I'm not doing this to control you. I'm doing it because that house is the place where your mother raised you, and it deserves to still be standing when you're ready to understand that. I'm proud of you. I have always been proud of you. That doesn't require you to reciprocate. Dad. The second document was the official property transfer paperwork, signed and witnessed and filed with the regional municipality of Durham. The house in Whitby. 3 bedrooms. Nearly paid off. The house where Patrick had grown up, where Margaret's garden still ran along the south fence, where his hockey trophies were still in the upstairs closet because I'd never had the heart to move them. Worth, conservatively, $940,000. I watched Patrick's face as he read. He read the letter twice. Then he looked at the deed. Then he looked up at me. His face had done something I hadn't seen it do in years. The careful composure had come apart, not dramatically, but in the way that means something real is happening underneath. Dad, he said. It's done, I said. Already filed, it's yours. Claire leaned over and read the letter in his hand. She looked up at me and I saw something shift in her expression, something more honest than anything she'd shown me before. Mr. Mayan, Gerald, she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. It's what Margaret wanted, I said. Patrick folded the documents carefully and put them back in the envelope and held it against his chest for a moment, in a way that looked involuntary, like he was steadying himself. He stopped, started again. The things I said tonight. Patrick, I said, it's your wedding day. We'll talk when you're ready. I said goodbye to Claire. I shook Patrick's hand, and then he grabbed me in a hug that lasted longer than the one in the receiving line, longer and tighter, and I felt him breathing. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice close to my ear. I didn't know I was doing that until just now. I know, I said. I know you didn't. I found my jacket, said goodnight to the young men at my table, and walked out through the vineyard hall into the warm June evening. The escarpment was dark against a sky that still held the last pale light, and the vines ran in long, quiet rows toward the ridge. And I stood there for a moment thinking about Margaret, about 32 years, about the way love is mostly just showing up when it's inconvenient and asking for nothing back. Then I got in my truck and drove home. It was nearly midnight when I pulled into my driveway. The Whitby street was quiet, porch lights on, the neighborhood sounds of summer through the open window. I sat in the truck for a moment before going in, looking at the house, the trim I'd painted last August, the garden Margaret had designed, the window of what used to be Patrick's room. $940,000. Every penny of the equity I'd ever accumulated. It had seemed, when I signed the papers 6 weeks ago, like a strange thing to do. Now it seemed like the only thing I could have done. Inside, I made a cup of the chamomile tea Margaret had always kept in the second cabinet, and I sat in her chair, and I was quiet. At 12:40, my phone lit up on the side table. Patrick. I let it ring through, not out of anger, but out of tiredness. There would be time. Not tonight, but there would be time. The voicemail notification appeared. I waited 10 minutes before I listened to it. His voice was different in the message than it had been in any phone call for 2 years. Steadier but looser, the way voices get when the performance layer has come off. Dad, he said, I don't know how to do this in a voicemail. I'm going to come to Whitby when we're back from the honeymoon. And I'm going to sit in your kitchen, and I'm going to try to say what I should have been saying for the past 2 years, and probably longer. I'm not going to try to do that now because you deserve to have me look at you when I say it. I wanted you to know I understand what you gave me tonight. Not just the house. I understand what you gave me. There was a pause. She would have liked tonight, he said. The vineyard and the light on the water and all of it. I know she would have. I'm sorry she wasn't there. The message ended. I sat in the green wingback chair for a long time. Outside the window, the street was still. Somewhere down the block, a screen door opened and closed. The neighbor's dog made one low sound and then went quiet. I thought about what Richard Calloway could offer my son, and it was not nothing. He could offer connection and status, and the particular social confidence that comes from moving in rooms where everyone knows your name. Those were real things. They had real value, but there is a kind of value that doesn't fit in a toast at an engagement party, that doesn't show up in the conversations at tables and in your reception halls. It's the kind that lives in a house where your mother's garden is still growing along the south fence. It's the kind that gets filed quietly at the regional office and doesn't announce itself. It just waits. That was what I had given him. Not a lesson. Not revenge. Just the truth of what 32 years look like when you finally held it in both hands. I finished my tea. I washed the cup. I turned off the lamp in the living room and went to bed. Patrick came to Whitby 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in July, and we sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours. He talked and I talked, and we went through things neither of us had said in years. Some of it painful in the ordinary way that honest conversations usually are, some of it easy in a way I hadn't expected. He told me things about the last 2 years that I hadn't known, about the pressure he'd felt to belong in Claire's world, about the shame he'd managed by directing it somewhere safer than himself. I told him things about the years after Margaret that I hadn't told anyone, about how quiet the house had gotten, about how I'd learned to be a person on my own after 34 years of not being one. Before he left, he stood in the doorway of his old room upstairs and looked at his hockey trophies on the shelf and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I want to bring my kids here someday, when we have them." I told him the house would be here. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and 32 years sat quietly between us, the way only the things that actually happened can. Then we went back downstairs, and I made us both a cup of tea. I've had a long time to think about what happened that June evening in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and what I keep coming back to is this. The way a person treats you when they believe they no longer need you tells you everything about who they actually are, and everything about who you are, depending on how you respond. Gerald could have stood up at that reception and made a scene. He could have confronted his son in front of 200 guests, could have called out the years of overtime and sacrifice and double shifts in Oshawa, could have demanded to be seen. Most of us would have understood if he had, but he didn't. And that restraint, that quiet, deliberate choice to act from his values rather than his wounds, is the thing I find myself thinking about most. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on a resume or in a toast at a vineyard. It's the intelligence to understand that your worth doesn't depend on whether someone else acknowledges it. Gerald knew what 32 years meant. He didn't need Patrick to announce it in the speech to make it real. The deed to that house in Whitby was already filed. The love was already given. The record was already set. Nothing Patrick said at that microphone could erase any of it. And Gerald understood that, deeply, in a way that only comes from years of living with your own choices and being at peace with them. What Patrick did, gradually replacing his father with a wealthier, more prestigious man, wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something quieter and more common, the slow erosion that happens when a person starts measuring the people in their life against a standard they borrowed from somewhere else. He looked at Gerald and saw limitations. He looked at Richard and saw a possibility. And he made the mistake that many of us make at some point. He confused the ceiling of a man's bank account with the ceiling of his character. The consequence arrived not as punishment, but as clarity. When Patrick held that envelope and read what was inside, not money, not a check, but a deed and a letter, and 32 years folded into 4 pages of careful cursive. He had to reckon with the distance between what he thought his father was and what his father had actually been doing all along. That reckoning is hard. It's supposed to be hard. That kind of honesty is not comfortable, but it is the beginning of becoming someone better. What I take from Gerald's story is something I try to hold on to in my own life. The way you build something over decades, quietly, without applause, without anyone watching. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. The people who love you without an audience, who show up when it's inconvenient, who keep their promises even when the person they made them to is no longer alive to hold them to it. Those people are not failures. They are the foundation, and foundations don't need to be celebrated to hold the house up. I think about Margaret's garden still growing along the south fence in Whitby. I think about Patrick standing in the doorway of his old room, looking at his trophies on the shelf, saying he wanted to bring his children there someday. Some things take time to be understood. Some gifts can only be received once you've grown into them. Gerald understood that. He waited. And in the end, the truth didn't need to be argued. It just needed to be handed over in a plain cream envelope, quietly, between the first dances, on a summer evening when the light on the escarpment was exactly right.